Thank you all for coming this evening. There's been so much buzz about this program, and I know we're all pretty excited about hearing everybody's comments. I wanted to take a moment and just thank all of our members that are here this evening, board members, because with your wonderful support, these types of programs can happen. And how many people are from Maryland this evening? Could I just see a show of hands? Wow, okay. All right, that is awesome. I really want to take this moment to thank you. Great appreciation for making the drive from Maryland. And we have quite a few Maryland supporters and friends of the National Sporting Library and Museum now. And we have one board member who, if I just describe a little, you're probably going to know who he is, who's ridden in the Maryland Hunt Cup 16 times. Very quick to say he's never won it once. Fell off several times, came in second a few times, and actually raced against Gerry, and I think Gerry beat him. So, yes, exactly. Really want to move on to our presentation, and I wanted to take a moment and introduce Gerry to everyone. If you haven't met him, if you wouldn't mind coming up, and I think you were going to have a few words, a little bit of an overview, and then we'll turn the program over to Julie, who's also from Maryland. So she'll be jumping in a little bit later too. So again, thank you all for coming. If you're not a member, please consider joining. And there is an incredible exhibit here. We were very, very fortunate to receive approximately 85 paintings from the Chrysler family, all gun dogs, beautiful, beautiful paintings. So if you haven't seen that, these are now in our permanent collection. So make another visit if you haven't seen it. So I'm going to turn things over to Gerry, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you all. First and foremost, Elizabeth, I want to thank you and the National Sporting Library and Museum for your incredible hospitality. Working with you all for this event, and we've done now 22 of these. Your team is actually the best team that we have ever encountered. And the head of that team for our event is Julie Banner. And Julie, you are a joy. I just can't even begin to tell you how much fun, I'm going to use that word fun, Rob and I talked about that earlier, how much fun it has been to work with you.
Good.
And you do not miss a thing. So Elizabeth, you have assembled a wonderful team. Elizabeth, we thank you. Julie, we thank you. We thank the National Sporting Library and Museum. And we thank each and every one of you for coming. On our Brewster book team, I also want to thank Lauren, who is our book publicist. And Lauren, you have done a great job. Thank you, Lauren. So Lauren helped coordinate all the details, get all the parties together. And Lauren, this event would not have happened without you. So thank you very much. Yes, she's wearing one of my father's old political buttons. I'm a Brewster booster. Very, very good. And Middleburg Books, are they in the other room still? All right, so I want to thank Middleburg Books, and it's a wonderful bookstore, and if you get the chance, please use them. They're selling the Brewster book in the library, and that will be, is that Middleburg Books coming out here? Yeah. Middleburg Books, we want to thank you very much for helping. Middleburg Books. So Middleburg Books in the library is selling books, and the author, John Frece, is happy to sign them. I'm happy to sign them. And you know, when you're thinking about Christmas shopping in July, you could get a whole stack of books, and you've taken care of all your Christmas shopping. So we hope you'll do it. Also, the young man over there helping with the handouts, he's my assistant, Shannon Sheets, but more importantly, he ended up, and John Frece and I are both very grateful for this, because our computer skills are not like perhaps some younger people's are. And so Shannon was able to look things up and research things and fact check things, for which John Frece, the author, and I are very grateful. This book has turned out very, very well, but Shannon, you had a lot to do with it. Thank you, Shannon Sheets. And our moderator tonight is Jeb Hannum. And he's here with his wife, Emily, and his children, Chloe, Flora, and Jack. Jack, I can't believe how tall you got. What happened there? What happened there? And the Hannums and the Brewsters go way back. The Hannums primarily from the Unionville area, and the Brewsters from Baltimore County. And for a number of years, we owned a horse together that competed in the Maryland Hunt Cup. And I want to thank the entire Hannum family, Emily, you and Jeb, and what fun we had competing in the Hunt Cup together. So let's give it up for the Hannum family. And there are a number of people that in my remarks, when we talk, like particularly in the horse community, steeplechase community, I'm going to pick some people out. Where's Greg Ryan go? Oh, there he is. I'm going to talk about you in a moment. But there are a number of people in the horse community I want to single out. But I also want to acknowledge somebody that I went to school with half a century ago. I went to Gilman School in Baltimore, but I also went up to a boarding school in Massachusetts. And at Brooks was the big man on campus. He was the star of the campus. And it doesn't surprise me at all that he went on to serve our country and our nation as the chairman of the Federal Election Commission, Trevor Potter. Thank you, Trevor. And a small personal footnote, it's funny. So you'll hear about it later. But I rode in a number of races. I rode in a few Maryland Hunt Cups and up and down the East Coast and all that, and never very well. But I also had the chance to row crew, and two of my teammates are here who I want to acknowledge and appreciate, because we had this wonderful Potomac Boat Club crew team, and we went and rowed in the Royal Henley Regatta. So Chris Walsh and Michael Kotick, you guys being here means so much to me. And we snuck a picture of us over here in my dad's collection. You all may have seen it. So we had our Potomac Boat Club crew team, which represented the United States in international competition. And so we had the U.S. senators from every state, from all the members of our crew team there. And I'll finish with this. It caused a lot of confusion in the race riding community, because all these jocks would come over from England and Ireland. And I'd say to them, and they knew I rode in the Maryland Hunt Cup, that I rode in all these races. And I said to them, you know, I rode in a lot of races in England. You did? I said, yes. And they said, well, did you ride races at Aintree, at Cheltenham? Where did you? I said, I rode in a lot of races in England. And they said, where'd you? I said, well, we rode at the Henley Royal Regatta, Nottingham. Road. Which an Olympian like Nina Fout can appreciate the international dynamics of different sports. So I'll stop now. Just I wanted to thank, and there's so many people I'd like to mention by name, but I want to stop now and just thank all of you very, very much for coming. We're very, very grateful and appreciative that you're here. And let me just say that John and his wife Priscilla John wrote the book. Priscilla, for those that don't know, is one of the leading children's authors in the country. Middleburg Books, you back there still? Middleburg Books. All right, so Priscilla Cummings, truly, over the last many decades, is one of the leading children's books authors in the country. I would say leading, but she challenges me on that. But Red Kayak and all these books, and she travels, Priscilla Cummings travels all over the world doing talks on children's books. John, John, your effort to put together my father's biography, I didn't write it. I'm just a spectator. I'm along for the ride.
Not exactly.
The guy that did all the hard work is John Frece, the author. And John, you have written an incredible book. It's taken off. It's a finalist for Book of the Year in the History Department. It's currently being considered for movie options. It's sold thousands of books. It's become an Amazon bestseller. Let's give it up for the author, John Frece.
Wow, that's a tough act to follow.
One of us was a politician before.
Well, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Julie Banner, and I am the Education and Marketing Manager here at the NSLM. And I'm going to take a page out of Gary's book and say, it has been so much fun to work with you. And we really, really, hopefully put together a program that you all really enjoy. I was going to do an intro for everyone, so I will try not to be redundant, and I may have to read because these are some very accomplished men. Before I do that, I'm going to put in a little plug that we have some fabulous other events here at the National Sporting Library and Museum this weekend, and I hope you'll come. Tomorrow night, from 6 to 8, we've got the Swing Tones Band playing on our lawn. It's a free concert. You should definitely come. Bring your blanket, bring your friends, bring some wine, enjoy. And on Sunday, we've got the International Fly Fishing Film Festival, and that'll be all day. We'll have fly casting lessons, fly tying lessons, and then 9 acclaimed films to follow. So it's gonna be really, really great if you're into fly fishing, or even if you're not. All right, well, on to the program. I was thrilled to receive the book from Lauren. When she sent it to me, I thought, oh my God, this is crazy. These are my people, these are my Baltimore people. So it was really exciting, and we've had a blast putting all this together. I was raised in northern Baltimore County too, same neck of the woods as the Brewster family, so it really is special to me. While I was reading the biography, I thought, wow. I mean, I was just slack-jawed with some of these things, and obviously you'll find things that are more interesting than I did, but I'm gonna go ahead and share some of my favorites with you. Did you know that Daniel Brewster was the only Maryland to win a presidential primary, defeating Alabama Governor George C. Wallace in 1964? Anyone? And his victory over Wallace directly led to the passage of civil rights in 1964. The Civil Rights Act?
Yeah.
Yeah. In addition, at 19, he was reportedly the youngest Marine Corps combat officer in World War II. He was injured 7 times. He was elected to the Maryland House of Delegates at 26. He employed Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi and Senate Majority Leader Steny Hoyer as staff members for their first jobs on Capitol Hill. Crazy. This is one of my favorites, if I haven't already told you, because I feel like I've told everyone. But in 60 years, the Brewster family had 84 participants in the Maryland Hunt Cup. 84 individual participants in the Maryland Hunt Cup. Did I tell you 84? 84. One of my favorites too. Daniel Brewster returned to steeplechase riding at the age of 54 after a 30-year hiatus. It gives me hope. We need to catch up. Anyway, it is my pleasure to introduce these guys. I feel like you already know some of them, but let's start with John. John Frece is the author of the book. This is his 4th book. He also wrote a book about Senator Joseph D. Tidings and former Governor Harry R. Hughes. He wrote a book on Maryland's controversial land use policy known as Smart Growth. He is a graduate of William and Mary. He was also honorably discharged as the first lieutenant in the U.S. Army. John was a former Maryland State House Bureau Chief for United Press International and the Baltimore Sun. The list goes on and on, but I know I'm going to be short, be sweet, and be seated. So, Gerry, our gentleman on the far right, obviously, has introduced himself. He was born and raised on Worthington Farm, which is the home of the Maryland Hunt Cup. He let us know he did not practice very often on that Hunt Cup course. Interesting fact, he's also the tallest licensed jockey in America. He wrote Prue, as he told you earlier, and after graduating from Princeton, he wrote a senior thesis on his father's political agenda. Gerry worked for U.S. Senator during the Carter and Reagan administrations. After graduating from law school, Gerry served as a prosecutor in Maryland following his service in the Maryland House of Delegates. For the past 6 years, he's been the chairman of the board, the Maryland State Fair, and Agricultural Society. Gerry. Now, our friend Jeb Hannum, who's the moderator for this evening. Jeb grew up in Unionville, Pennsylvania, and he received a degree in European history from Hobart William Smith Colleges. He then went on to receive his master's in government administration from the University of Pennsylvania. Jeb's resume also includes working for Governor Michael Hassell of Delaware, Senator Arlen Specter of Pennsylvania, and he's volunteered on numerous federal, state, and local campaigns. Currently, Jeb is serving as the executive director for the Virginia Equine Alliance. And for those of you who are not familiar with the organization, they represent all horse racing and breeding interests in the state. Another steeplechase rider, he also rode as an amateur timber jockey and competed in 2 Maryland Hunt Cups. Not 84, but pretty good. Upon moving to Middleburg in 2014 with his family, Jeb has been hunting with the Orange County Hounds, among other things, very involved in the community. On that note, I will turn the microphone over to these gentlemen. Thanks so much.
Julie and Elizabeth, thank you very much. And Gerry and John, welcome to Middleburg.
Thank you.
Let's get started. So Julie did a good overview of Senator Brewster's life, and we're going to sort of dive in on some of the things that she mentioned in a little bit more detail. But I thought we'd start out just talking about the origins of the book. So Gerry, I'll start with you. If you could, just tell us, when did you have this idea? What were some of the challenges? And then John, when did you get the call? And how did it start out? So we'll start with you, Gerry.
So thank you again, Jeb. So when I was in the Maryland House of Delegates, the head of the Baltimore Sun, the Annapolis bureau chief, was John Frece. So John Frece covered me and the entire General Assembly, and we got to know each other then. And John then wrote many books, as you just heard. And I saw him at a party at Senator Joe Tidings' house, and John had just finished ghostwriting the autobiography of United States Senator Joseph Tidings. And John and I talked, and I said, John, what are you going to do now? And he said, well, I don't know. Might write another book. And I said, well, how about the Danny Brewster story? And he said, I don't know. I don't know that that's very interesting.
No, I didn't say it. I thought that, but I didn't say it.
So I gave it, my good political spin as best I could, and John was like, And so anyway, I said, well, John, I wrote my senior thesis at Princeton on my dad. And he said, well, I'll take a look at it if you want to get it to me. And it was 275 pages. And I sent it to John, and John read it. And he said, well, maybe there is a story here that might be worth telling. And so John wanted to tell the story. He agreed to tell the story. And I'll say this. John Frece spent 5 years full-time researching and writing the Brewster book. And hopefully you'll get the book. Did I mention they're for sale? And John did a great job. He literally did go all over the world. He went, my stepmother was the first licensed woman horse trainer in Ireland. She owned the largest horse farm in Ireland, then called Palmerstown Stud in County Kildare. And it's now a golf course. But John and Priscilla went over there, and they went up to Yale and New Haven, Connecticut to look through the Brewster Ambassador Bullet papers there, and went up to my father's prep school at St. Paul's in Concord, New Hampshire. So they really did an incredible job researching and traveling, and John writing the book. So John agreed to write the book. I was grateful because I felt as though my father's story deserved to be told. He had many accomplishments, but he also got in trouble. And unfortunately, when one gets in trouble in life, people tend to remember the trouble more than the accomplishments. And I wanted my father's full story to be told. And John said, well, Gerry, will the Brewster family support the efforts? Will they be okay if I write that story? And I said, John, the Brewster family has one request, one thing we would insist on. And John said, what's that? And we said, tell the truth. Don't sugarcoat it. Tell the good, the bad, and the ugly. And there was plenty of all of it. And John said, I wouldn't do a book any other way. I'm going to tell the truth. And I said, that's what we want you to do. And he said, well, some of it's pretty ugly. And I said, it is. But, everybody needs to know that you can hit rock bottom in life. And my father did, and you can still come back. And John, I want to thank you again for telling the story so truthfully, honestly, and fairly. So that's how the book came about.
And so, John, what were some of the challenges that you had as you sort of got started with?
Well, first thing is I never knew Danny Brewster. And I never knew much about a lot of the things I ended up having to write about. He was, if anyone here has read the book yet, there's several chapters on his fighting in Okinawa. I knew that Okinawa was an island in the Pacific and that there had been a World War II battle there, and that was all I knew. And I really learned a lot more. I didn't know much about the horse culture, frankly, in Baltimore County. I knew there were beautiful farms up there and a lot of acreage, but I just didn't quite understand the culture, and Gerry certainly introduced me to that. Gerry's right about he sent me his thesis from Princeton, and it chronicled his father's entire political career. And it was then that I began to see the ups and downs of his life. I began to see how this was a guy who was so popular. He won his first 12 elections. He was the golden boy of Maryland politics. And then things started going south, and they went south for a decade. And a lot of it had to do with his inability to stop drinking. But that wasn't the only thing. He made some errors in judgment politically. He made some errors in judgment with his family, I think. And then later on in life, he was betrayed by a close associate. And so it was a really up and down life. And after reading Gerry's thesis, I realized there really was a story there. Gerry's right, but he first said, after you finish the tidings book, would you consider looking at my father's story? And I said I'd consider that. But I did think to myself, and I've said this publicly before, there's no story there. I was wrong. There's one other document that I was provided with by Gerry early on, and that was Danny had a 45-page long handwritten war diary.
He's talking to you.
Yeah, I think so. And that war diary was just absolutely terrific. It was written by a 19 and 20-year-old, and it was written between 1943 and 1945. The final entry came 8 days after the Japanese surrendered. And he would be writing this on ships. He'd write it between fighting. He'd be writing it at tents, whenever he could. And he wrote about, he had just broken off a very brief engagement with a young woman at 19, and he went off to war saying he didn't care whether he lived or died. He was so lovesick. And but he spent a lot of time in that war diary talking about his ambitions in life and what he wanted to do and how he wanted to present himself. And he started making lists of different words that he really wanted to understand, or concepts in government. And you could see even the beginning of his political interest back in that war diary. And then he talked about the fighting. He talked about watching his platoon sergeant get his head blown off while he's standing there talking to him. All the awful gore and savage fighting in Okinawa, it just comes alive in this memoir. And without that, I wouldn't have had the map to that part of his life. The last thing I'll say about that, and then I'll turn it back to Jeb, is that one thing I would say I learned about Brewster, but I think this is true of many people who go to war, is that once they go to war, it affects them for their life. I think it led to Danny's drinking. It led to a lot of problems he had. He always denied that there was such a thing as PTSD. But members of his family fairly consistently talked about nightmares, talked about finding him with a loaded gun in his hand or in his, cradled in his lap, worried about suicide. It was, I think the war never left him. One more anecdote about that is that one of his youngest daughter from his third marriage told me that he would spend hours, this is later in life, probably the happiest time of his life, and he would spend hours on his tractor mowing the fields out behind their house at Windy Meadows Farm. And she asked him one time, what do you think about out there? You're not listening to what was then a Walkman, if anyone remembers what Walkman were. He says, you're not listening to a Walkman, what are you doing out there? And he says, I'm thinking about the decisions I made and the people that might have lived if I hadn't done this or hadn't done that. It just haunted him. And I think, Gary, you want to add something to that? Or?
Yeah, just to the war thing, I think it's important to give a little bit more color on that. So the first really rough engagement of my father in the South Pacific during World War II, again, as a very young lieutenant, was in Guam. He was in his foxhole. And in the middle of the night, he heard sort of rustling, and he's asleep in his foxhole. And at the last minute, he opens his eyes, and he sees a Japanese soldier with a knife coming in, stabbing him. And my father threw up his forearm, and the Japanese soldier kept stabbing. And for the rest of his life, he had 3 scars on his right forearm from fending off the Japanese soldier. His runner in the foxhole immediately next to him heard the commotion, saw what was happening, pulled out his pistol, shot the Japanese soldier dead, and he dropped right on top of my father in his foxhole. John talks about my father waking up in the middle of the night, the rest of his life screaming. He did. And imagine, you're asleep in your foxhole and somebody jumps in and starts stabbing you. So that was traumatic for him. And then on Okinawa, you may see in some posters out there and some newspaper articles that my father was wounded 7 times in the battle for Okinawa. The second day of the battle, he leads his troops into a ravine, and it's a trap. The caves, the pillboxes, open up with fire. Most of his men are killed or wounded, and he sends runners back to try to get artillery support. They're shot and killed dead as they go. Just in that battle of Okinawa with 7 wounds, my father was shot in the foot, shot in the neck, shot in the head. We still have his helmet where the bullet goes in here, creases his forehead, comes out the other side. And by the way, people do say that my father being shot in the head explains why he went into politics. Then they're later crossing a river, and he's holding his rifle over his head, and he's shot in the finger. It's just carnage, and you don't get over that. And sir, you told me you served in the Marine Corps?
I did, yes.
Thank you for your service, Semper Fi.
Thank you.
What those folks went through in combat, we can't put words on it, and that certainly affected my father's life and certainly contributed to his alcoholism.
Yeah. So with that, I think that's a good segue. I just wanted to read a paragraph from the book. Danny Brewster's experiences in Okinawa would haunt him for the rest of his life. A month after the Japanese were finally defeated, Brewster recounted throughout the final pages of his diary the long list of Marine friends and comrades who had been killed or wounded. He said the overall experience, quote, fried my mind in a way nothing else ever could have. So I think that sums it up.
Yeah.
So the diary, I'm glad you brought that up, John. You mentioned how important that was in your research and for understanding the senator's direct, thoughts at that time at a young age. So in coming back from World War II, he was already thinking about the next steps, and maybe you could talk a little bit about what the diary reflected in terms of his plans for running for office and how he was starting to prepare himself for the next chapter in his life.
There was nothing that I recall specifically in the diary about wanting to come back and run for office, but there were inklings of an interest in politics in general, and there was a sense of this young man sort of awakening to the possibilities in life, and that he knew he could be somebody. I mean, he came from, a very well-to-do, connected, successful family. He went to very good prep schools. He was a smart guy, and he could see that when he got out of this carnage in the South Pacific, the world was his oyster. He was going to be able to really do something. I don't think there was anything in there, I'm going to run for the House of Delegates. But as soon as he got back, that's one of the first things he did. In fact, he would have run the year he got back, but he had missed the filing deadline. He had to wait one term. But and when he ran, he was wildly successful. He was the biggest vote getter in just about every one of his elections. And it was only later when, and there was a reference earlier to him running against George Wallace in 64, that he really ran into some opposition, and it was not to him, it was the issue.
I would just add on to that, when my father came back from the war, one of the things that propelled him into politics was his concern about civil rights,
Oh, yeah.
about basic human dignity. And he had served with people of color over in the South Pacific, and they were given the worst kinds of jobs. They would drive the ammunition trucks that were targets to be blown up. And so they weren't treated that well there, but they relied on them, and they worked together, and they were his comrades and his colleagues. They were in service together to defend the United States. And when he came home, he and a friend, Ike Eigelhart, decided to form a veterans group. And they took the veterans, they decided to have their first dinner to talk about veterans' concerns and issues. They took them to a place that's no longer in business, but it was called the Green Spring Inn. And they had all these veterans in Baltimore County and surrounding areas. They went to the Green Spring Inn, and the proprietor met them at the door. And the proprietor said, "I'm sorry, you all can't come in here." And my father said, "Why not? We let you all know we've got a big group coming, and we want to have dinner here." And the proprietor said, "We don't allow people of color in this place." And my father said, "Are you kidding me? We just got back from defending the country, representing the United States in the Marine Corps in World War II, and we can't come in here and have a meal? No." So my father didn't live too far away, and so he invited all of them back to his house. He had a big house. In fact, the family house growing up was the largest private home in Maryland, with 17 bedrooms, each having its own bathroom. It was called Wycliffe. It's now called Maryville School for Girls. So it was a big castle, and he had everybody back, and he was then shunned in the Green Spring and Worthington Valleys. People called him a traitor to his class. Said why is Danny Brewster having these people into his house for dinner seated at the dining room table? So he was outraged by that, and he decided, if you're outraged about something, you should do something about it. Don't just complain. So that's when he first ran for office in his 20s. Started out pretty young, and got elected, as John said, for 12 straight elections, and he ended up being a United States Senator in his 30s. Pretty young.
There had been Jim Crow laws in effect in Maryland since about 1900, and they were still in effect when Danny arrived in the General Assembly in 1954? 51. And it was in that first term in the House of Delegates that they finally repealed the Jim Crow laws. And Danny was on the Judiciary Committee that provided the votes to do it.
Amazing. So I want to talk a little bit more about the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and George Wallace, as I know that's going to be interesting for everybody. But before we kind of dive into that, one of the things I think this group is going to be particularly interested in is the Senator's role in protecting Assateague Island. And as I know, we're all conservationists here. And so, Gerry, if you can just sort of tell the group about that, I think that would be of particular interest.
Well, it is a big issue, and he had an instrumental role in it. But, Jeb, I don't want to mess up your program. John actually went there and looked through the records at Assateague, and there's a huge poster there that the President of the United States signed, Lyndon Johnson, and all of the co-sponsors and the environmentalists. They all signed this big picture, and it was written in the sand, "Save Assateague." And John, you ought to really tell us.
Those people know Assateague Island? Yeah. Well, so there had been a couple storms there. One of them was a storm in 1933 or 32, something like that.
It was slated for development.
And it's the one that cut the channel in between what is now Ocean City and Assateague. And then developers saw that they could make Assateague into another Ocean City, and they platted every foot of it, from the ocean shoreline to the bay shoreline. And they even went out and put in street sign numbers even though there was no building yet. And they sold these lots to people in Florida and people in the Midwest and all over, and people thought they were getting waterfront property. Well, they were getting waterfront all right. It was every time the storms came in, the water came in too, and it was this deep. And there are pictures of opponents of this development standing by the street signs with water up to their knees.
But they owned the land, and they didn't want it taken over as national park.
Well, that's right. And the developers didn't want it, and the local governments didn't want it. But the Kennedy administration Interior Secretary Stewart, right?
Yep.
He was the leader who Danny worked with, and they took members of key committees out to Assateague. They walked it, and they finally were able to pass legislation that turned it into a national seashore.
So it started with Kennedy, but it ended up actually being in the Johnson administration. Right. And because of my father's great relationship with President Lyndon Johnson, and he had just defeated Alabama Governor George Wallace to win the primary on behalf of President Johnson, my father could almost do no wrong. So he went to the president and said, listen, Assateague Island is slated for development, intense development. I'd like to put in a bill to create a national seashore park so it's preserved in perpetuity. So Brewster's bill, he was the sole sponsor, but then he went around and got many of his Senate colleagues, and they liked him. So that he got them as co-sponsors, and the bill passed. And because of Danny Brewster's bill, Assateague Island National Seashore is preserved in perpetuity. Yeah.
So it's a wonderful conservation story, so thank you. So let's get back to 1964, the presidential primary. And when I was reading the book, I remember sort of stopping and scratching my head and trying to understand what was going on. So Gerry, just give us a little background. Let's take a step back. Why was your father, running for essentially the president at that time? What were the dynamics? And this is a fascinating part of the story.
So President Kennedy, who is a close friend of my father's, is assassinated in November of 1963. Lyndon Johnson becomes president. Lyndon Johnson had only been president for a few months before the 1964 presidential election. So he's busy trying to be president, learn the job, and he also wants to be respectful of the Kennedy family and not be out there campaigning, and so he wants to be president. So the biggest piece of legislation, arguably in our nation's history, is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is being filibustered by the U.S. Senate, meaning there's enough senators talking, they won't let it come up for a vote. So George Wallace seizes the opportunity, the racist governor of Alabama, the one that stood in the schoolhouse steps, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Wallace enters a few primaries, and back then not every state had a presidential primary. He went to the northern states first and lost. He only entered one state south of the Mason-Dixon line, George Wallace, to run against Lyndon Johnson, and that was Maryland. So George Wallace decides he's going to run against President Johnson, and his goal is to hold up passage of the Civil Rights Act of '64. So President Johnson says, my friend Danny Brewster is leading vote getter in Maryland's won all these elections, a United States Senator. I'm not going to run against Wallace, Johnson says. I'm going to ask Danny Brewster to do it. So that way, if Danny Brewster wins, beats George Wallace, Danny Brewster can say, well, I did it on behalf of President Johnson. The victory was for him. And if Danny Brewster loses, then I'm going to say Danny Brewster ran a terrible campaign. Awful candidate. So it was the national story. When I say national, I'm not even kidding. '64 is a long time ago, but this was for the most important legislation in our nation's history. Never before in our country's history had a filibuster on civil rights been broken. 11 tries, 11 attempts to break the filibuster on civil rights. One had never been broken. So Brewster and Wallace debate. They debate on national TV. We're familiar with national presidential debates. The big one in '64 was Senator Daniel Brewster versus Governor George Wallace on the leading talk show program of the day. moderated by Howard K. Smith on a program called Issues and Answers. Howard K. Smith was also the moderator for the first Kennedy-Nixon debate. And so the eyes of the nation were on Maryland, and it all came down to the end. And at the very end, it looked like Wallace could win Maryland, because it's a southern state. And so the Kennedy family got together. And Jack Kennedy had only been assassinated a few months earlier, so they weren't campaigning. They were staying out of it. And they decided as a family that this race was too important. So for the first time since President Kennedy's assassination, the Kennedy family engaged, came to Maryland, and campaigned on behalf of Danny Brewster and encouraged Marylanders to vote for him over George Wallace. Because of Danny Brewster's race, it wasn't just the Kennedy family, but it was also other leading United States senators, Frank Church, Birch Bayh, a bunch of them all came. And at the end, when it was all over, it was again the lead national story. As you could see in front of the bar that were out there, the banner front page headlines of every newspaper in America, New York Times, LA Times, Miami Herald, all the papers, the banner front headline that next day was Brewster defeats Wallace. Walter Cronkite brought CBS National News down from New York to Baltimore at the Old Southern Hotel and reported the race precinct by precinct to the entire country. That's how important it is. Within 24 hours of Brewster beating Wallace, the leader of the Senate Republicans, Everett Dirksen, went to the Democratic floor leader, Hubert Humphrey, and said, Senator Humphrey, the Republicans are going to join the Northern Democrats to break the filibuster. You now have the votes. Brewster beat Wallace. We know a Southern civil rights filibuster has never been broken, but we're going to break this one. So within 24 hours of Brewster beating Wallace, the votes were there to break the filibuster, and within a few weeks, President Lyndon Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act of '64 into law. So that is something that was significant.
May I add a little bit more?
Yeah.
There's another part of this story, which is when Danny signed up to run against Wallace, some of his aides, and even Danny, I think at first, thought this shouldn't be a tough race in Maryland. I mean, Maryland's a very progressive place. Danny was very popular. He was always the biggest vote getter, and that he thought that this was not going to be as difficult as it turned out to be. And over the course of that primary campaign, he was booed, he was cursed, he was spat upon. People he thought were in his corner weren't in his corner. It wasn't because of him, it was because of the issue. They did not want to have integration. And I think that the experience of having people react to him that way, and to realize that people he thought were more willing to accept everyone in America, that it really shook him. It shook him. And Danny, at that point, had already begun drinking a little bit too much. And after the Wallace campaign, it really picked up. And I think I called the chapter about that in the book The Turning Point, because it was sort of the turning point in his life. Things began to go downhill, even though he won. And the other thing too is, Gerry and I have talked about, he won by 10 percentage points, which in most elections is a pretty substantial win. But there had been such early expectation that, oh, you beat this guy, he's a racist, he's a segregationist, this is Maryland, we'll beat him by 40 points or whatever. And there are people today, in fact, I interviewed some people who should have known better, who said, yeah, Danny really got beaten in that race. No, he didn't, he won by 10 points. But because he didn't do as well as people originally thought, it felt to many people, including maybe Danny, and certainly some of the people around him, that he had failed somehow.
So thank you, John. So I want to read another section of the book, which I think sets up the next sort of riveting piece of the story, and I'll ask Gerry to talk about that. So, so this, what I'm reading now is from Senator Brewster's first year in the Senate when he's putting his staff together. So Brewster made one other hire that year that would have an outsized effect on his life. The young man was John F. Jack Sullivan. Hiring Sullivan was surely unexceptional at the time, but his importance in the office and his influence with the senator grew. This hiring would eventually prove to be one of the most politically fateful decisions made by the new United States Senator. So, Gerry, can you talk a little bit about who was Jack Sullivan? How did he start out? What was his job when he was originally hired by your father? And then what did that lead to?
The story I'm about to tell you, you couldn't believe was true. And you'll read the book and you'll find out it was true. So my father gets elected to the United States Senate, very heady days during the Kennedy administration. And as I said, he and Jack Kennedy were close friends, South Pacific veterans together. His first hire was his receptionist, Nancy D'Alessandro Pelosi. Right out of college, he hires Nancy Pelosi to be his receptionist. Then he hires the man who went on to be majority leader for many years, Steny Hoyer. So Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer, for many years, the top two most powerful people in the House of Representatives, joined my father's staff. And they started their careers there. Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, one of her jobs besides being receptionist was to give tours of the Capitol that one day she would preside over. But then my father hired Jack Sullivan. My father was all about Marines. He was all about sports. And here was Jack Sullivan, who said he was a Marine, said he was an All-American basketball player, and he was a good basketball player. But he said he was on the Olympic team, which he was not. We found out later. So Jack Sullivan's hired, and he's a staff member there, and my father's administrative assistant, the chief of staff during the Wallace campaign, has a heart attack. He still works, but he was set back. So Jack Sullivan takes over as chief of staff. Very heady stuff for Jack Sullivan. And my father's drinking increased after that Wallace campaign, and he was less able to function and run his office. So Jack Sullivan's doing more and more. And Jack Sullivan's put in charge of the campaign for re-election. And Jack Sullivan is the one that takes contributions. Now keep in mind, this is pre-Watergate. The rules weren't really, different. So Jack Sullivan is going around getting contributions from everybody he can think of. And not all of them went into the campaign account. They went into Jack's pocket. And he got caught putting the money in his own pocket. And so he's going to get prosecuted. And he says to the government, oh, wait a minute. The money that you see that I took, I really gave it to Senator Brewster. He got the money. And my father said, absolutely not. I never did. So anyway, a very ambitious prosecutor indicts my father for bribery, accepting campaign contributions cash to vote certain ways. In ways that my father had always voted. His position didn't change. So he goes to trial. His case goes to the United States Supreme Court twice. The current Trump case on immunity, I actually listened to the oral arguments on it. That case is all based on the Danny Brewster case. So you hear Chief Justice John Roberts talking about the Danny Brewster case and those issues of immunity, etc. So my dad finally goes to trial. 6 years in the court. He's lost his name, he's lost his reputation, he's lost his job, he's lost his family, he's lost his fortune, he's lost his health, he's lost it all. And he's in the courts for 6 years. At the end of that trial, the jury of 12 comes back. This gets complicated. They come back and find him unanimously, all 12 jurors, find him unanimously not guilty of bribery, but the government at the last minute, as it's going to the jury for discussion, says, oh, there's a lesser included offense without corrupt intent, accepting an unlawful gratuity without corrupt intent. So the jury comes back, Brewster's not guilty of bribery, he wasn't corrupt, he didn't do anything corrupt, but here's his charge of accepting an unlawful gratuity without corrupt intent, so that the jury finds him guilty of that. goes to the Court of Appeals. Edward Bennett Williams, my dad's lawyer, the Court of Appeals unanimously says, this isn't fair. The jury found him guilty of something he was never even charged with. He didn't defend himself. And the distinction between a lawful campaign contribution, a bribe, and unlawful gratuity is hopelessly convoluted. So it went back and forth. The government, the Nixon administration, this is the kicker, and it's in the book. And I'll listen to this. You can listen to the tape in the Oval Office from President Richard Nixon. And here's what he says. Richard Nixon, it's on tape. Anybody can look it up, listen to it. He says to his henchmen, Halderman and Colson, Ehrlichman, in the Oval Office, get the FBI, get the Attorney General, go after this Danny Brewster case. Find out what other Democratic U.S. senators took contributions from this company that made them. We'll get them all. And the reason I want to get them all is because then we can persuade Sam Erwin, chairman of the Watergate Committee, to back off of Watergate. So they were going to use the Brewster case as leverage to get other... Richard Nixon says this on tape. And so they do that. And they say, after my father won his appeal on the charge, the lesser charge, they decide to prosecute him again. My father's sick, lost it all. He has nothing. He's got no home, no family, no farm, no job, nothing. So at the end of it, they said to him, well, Brewster, if you are willing to plead no contest to accepting, well, actually they wanted to plead guilty. He said, I won't. But they said, if you plead no contest to accepting an unlawful gratuity without corrupt intent and pay a $10,000 fine, no jail time, no suspended sentence, no probation, nothing. If you just pay a $10,000 fine and plead no contest, it's all over. So he says to me, says to our local minister, says to family members, what should we do? I don't want to plead no contest to anything. I didn't do a damn thing wrong. Well, we'd had enough. The family had after 6 years. So he paid a $10,000 fine and it was all over. But his reputation was destroyed. So that's what happened.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. So I want to take some questions from the audience. Before I do that, Gerry, you know, what do you want people to most remember about your father? You've spoken so eloquently about him, but I'll give you the last word before we take some questions.
Well, one thing I want to touch on is how much the horse community meant to him and how much steeplechase racing meant to him. So as a young man, he came back from the war and he rode in a lot of races. In fact, in 1948, right after the war, he won as a jockey, both the My Lady's Manor and the Josh Rush Street Memorial, the two races at the My Lady's Manor at the same day. And he rode in 5 Maryland Hunt Cups. He rode all up and down the East Coast. He loved riding here in Virginia, rode all over. In Middleburg, Loudon, Glenwood Park, just all over the place. He loved riding here. And continued to do that for the rest of his life. And as somebody said earlier, after a 30-year break, he came back in his mid-50s and started riding races again. And the My Lady's Manor race that he won in 1948, he rode it again in 1978, 30 years later, and came in third. And that meant a lot to him. And one of the proudest moments of his riding career, there's somebody here who had a lot to do with that. And when my father was no longer able to ride races, he owned horses and he ran in a lot of races. And one of the proudest days of his life was when Greg Ryan rode my father's horse Rolling Cart to victory in the Maryland Million. That helped my father on his recovery. That meant a lot to my father. So Greg Ryan, I want to thank you for doing that for my dad.
Gerry and I were the same age. I first went to Baltimore competing as jockeys, but to me, your father was always Mr. Brewster. Not anything like this, but I remember when I put on the silks, red and white silks, riding for he and Charlie Fenwick in the Maryland Million, how proud I was. And I remember going up there after the winner's circle, up at the turf. You had a box up there, and your whole family was there, and it was one of the few times that the owners were happier than the jockey.
Thank you, Greg. And just on this, and I can't thank you enough for what you did for my father. And in that regard, I was born and raised on the Maryland Hunt Cup course. My parents owned it. and the first 20 years of our lives we were there. And as you'll see, if you didn't get those handouts, you can get them on the way out. But my family there have been 84 efforts by my family to win the Hunt Cup. 84, including 60 years. So those 84 efforts were over 60 years. The first one was in 1911, and when my grandfather, Gerry L, my mother's father, he won it as the jockey in 1911. And so I rode in the Maryland Hunt Cup myself as a jockey 4 times, and I tell people that, and they go, "No, you didn't, you're too tall." And I said, no, I was the tallest licensed jockey in America. And people said, "No, you're not. Speedy Smithwick's taller." and so Speedy and I were friends, and so we at paddock one time we stood back to back, and I beat Speedy by about a half an inch. So I was truly the tallest licensed jockey in America.
So how tall are you?
Well, I'm shorter now.
So do we have any questions from the?
Wait, I got one more story I got to tell. Yeah, one more story I got to tell. So going into the 2017 Maryland Hunt Cup, I was the biggest losing owner in the history of the Hunt Cup. Nobody had lost it more times than me. It was 16 times as an owner. I tried to win it, never won it. And I tell people that, and they go, "Gary, you're not the biggest losing owner. Jay Griswold is." and Jay Griswold rode it 16 times without a victory, whereas I was the biggest. Then finally in 2017, a horse I owned did win it. So anyway, horses have meant a lot to me, to my family, to this community. All right, Jeff, thank you.
No, good. So I just wanted to see if Vivian.
Who was your trader? Who was your father's trader, or did he trade himself?
So my father primarily.
And how important was the trader in the family life?
Right. So my father primarily trained his own horses, but they did have a guy named Marcel Masson, and he was the farm manager and horse trainer. So he and my father did it together in those years right after the war. Then when he started 30 years later, he was truly the trainer himself, and then a flat track trainer was renting out his barn. And that was Mary Epler, and Mary Epler helped my father. And then for his jumpers, as Greg mentioned, Charlie Fenwick was one of his early trainers. And Charlie also rented out my father's barn and trained there. And then for my, altogether, I competed in 19 Maryland Hunt Cups, including recent ones. So my trainer in the early years was me, owner, trainer, rider. And is John Cole still here?
Yes, he's in the back.
So John Coles and I rode against each other in the Maryland Hunt Cup, and he was on a Pollinax. And John was a much better rider than I was. And we had fun together. But so in the early years it was me, but in recent years, Joe Gillette Davies was my trainer. And when I finally won as an owner the Maryland Hunt Cup in 2017, it was thanks to my very, very good friend Joe Gillette Davies and Joe's uncle, Joe Tidings, and my dad had served in the Senate together. And so Joe and I are very, very good friends. We even lived together for a while. Amazing we both survived.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
So what, you say your father lost everything. He didn't have a home, he didn't have a farm. So what happened to the big house with the 17 rooms?
So my father came from enormous wealth, and he was the 5th great-grandson of Benjamin Franklin, founding father. His grandfather was Attorney General of the United States, Benjamin Harris Brewster. Very prominent family, very wealthy family, and his grandparents built the largest private home in Maryland. And what happens is, generationally, people make the money, and then those below it spend it. And then my father, 6 years in court, when you're paying legal bills, he lost all of his money, and he and my mother split up, and he had to sell the farm, and he had nothing essentially, and so he had to start again. He started again as a counselor at the Veterans Administration Hospital, counseling people on alcoholism, and he and his new wife got a farm. They got a mortgage. And they raised horses and cattle and rented out the property, and they were able to make a go of it. So he ended up, the last years of his life in his 3rd marriage with 3 new children, he ended up being a very happy man for the first time in his life. He put the family first, and he really enjoyed farming, and he really enjoyed being involved with horses. Those were his
Oh,
passions.
marvelous thing. It's
Yeah.
wonderful.
Yeah.
How would you characterize his redemption?
So the redemption was really hard because of his addiction to alcohol, and he was in and out of rehab all the time. And his brothers, Andre Brewster and Walter Wicks Brewster, finally decided that they'd had enough, and the neighbors were all concerned Danny was going to kill himself. So they went over and literally busted in his door and took him to a new rehab place. And he'd previously spent 7 months hospitalized, but he was in and out of rehab. He finally went to a place, and the reason it took was because he was on kitchen duty. Here's this former United States Senator, only Marylander to win a presidential primary, and he's scrubbing pots and pans in rehab.
Wow.
And he sees this very, very attractive blonde scrubbing dishes. You're not meant to fraternize in rehab, but he did. And the two of them fell in love, and they got sprung. They got out, and they took up house together and got married and had 3 more children. So I really think it was his third wife, Judy, who they helped each other recover. They provided each other with love and support that provided him with the recovery and the redemption. And the redemption part also, it was amazing. He ended up coming back publicly as well. So he chaired the Korean War Memorial Commission. He chaired the Governor's Commission on Alcoholism. He chaired the Governor's Commission on AIDS. He was on the Greenways Commission. He was on the Port Commission. He was put on the board of the former members of Congress who he was afraid he had embarrassed, but they said, no, we want you to be an officer. He was put on the board of the National Parks Foundation for the whole country. And then he chaired a couple of hospitals and ended up chairing the hospital system that's now called MedStar. He was the chairman of when they first put the hospitals together. And that was an incredible story of redemption. This guy who lost it all came back to chair a major medical health system in this country. That's redemption.
That's amazing.
Is that in the book?
It is. The author never missed a thing.
So,
Well, most of it's in there.
He must have died of content,
He did.
perhaps.
He died a happy man
Yeah.
after a life of enormous ups and downs. And if I didn't mention it before, the books are available.
That's what I was leading to, Gerry. So John, I wanted to thank you for writing such a fabulous book. I got through this book in about 10 days. Every night I'd get in bed and I just thought, what's going to happen next? And then the next morning, say to Emily, you won't believe what happened next. And then I said, Emily, you've got to read it. And Emily went through it, and it's a fabulous book. And it's really interesting, and it's fun to read. It's very well written. The section on the trial, you know, I was kind of dreading it. I was like, oh no, we're going to read about a trial. But you handled that really well. And so please, everyone, go back. I know John and Gerry are going to stick around for signing and for more questions. But thank you all for coming out, and thank you to the museum. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you. Well done. Thank you.